Jake Mitchell walked into the sleek, modern event hall in the heart of New York City, the sharp scent of freshly brewed coffee, mixing with the faint hum of excited conversation. His black suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror. Shine? He had the look of someone who owned the room, and he usually did. A successful tech entrepreneur, Jake was used to being the center of attention. Today, he was here for a networking event with some of the most influential people in the business world. But something felt different. Something was missing. He scanned the room. His eyes fell on a man standing alone near the windows. He was dressed in a simple black jacket, his hair slightly messy, as if he didn't care about appearances. There was something calming about the way he stood, his hands tucked into his pockets, as if he was in no rush to be anywhere. Jake couldn't help but roll his eyes. Who was this guy? This was a business event, not some laid-back coffee shop hangout. People here should look sharp, be sharp. And yet, here was this guy, looking as though he had wandered in off the street. Jake took a deep breath, brushed off the feeling of irritation and walked over, determined to introduce himself to as many people as possible. After all, business was about connections, and Jake Mitchell never missed an opportunity. He approached the man casually, not even bothering to introduce himself first. "I don't know who you are," Jake said bluntly, "but you're definitely dressed like you don't belong here. This isn't some casual meetup. If you're here to make a name for yourself, you might want to put a little more effort into your appearance." The man didn't react immediately. Instead, he looked at Jake for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his face. Jake chuckled, thinking it was just a harmless comment, that the man would laugh it off. But instead, the stranger slowly shook his head. "I guess you're right," the man replied softly. "I don't really care about fitting in, but I suppose that's the price you pay when you don't play by the rules." Jake couldn't help but feel a little annoyed by the calmness in the man's voice. He was used to people responding nervously, or at worst, defensively to his comments. But this guy wasn't intimidated at all. Maybe he's just too awkward to say anything back, Jake thought. "I guess you don't care much for appearances," Jake said, trying to mask his irritation with a thin smile. "But in the world of business, perception is everything. It's not just about what you can do, it's about how you present yourself." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression still unreadable. "Is it?" he asked quietly, taking a step back, as if considering Jake's words for the first time. "And what happens when the people who make all the rules are wrong?" Jake froze. Something about the question made him uneasy, but he quickly brushed it off. This guy's clearly a weirdo, Jake thought to himself. He wasn't going to let this conversation drag him down. "Anyway, enjoy your day," Jake said curtly, turning to walk away. But before he could take another step, the man's voice stopped him. "Jake Mitchell, right?" the man called after him. Jake turned back, surprised that the stranger knew his name. "Yeah, that's me. Who are you?" The man gave him a small smile. "Let's just say I'm someone you'll be hearing a lot more about soon." Jake laughed, clearly uncomfortable. "We'll see about that." And with that he walked away, already forgetting about the strange encounter. But what Jake didn't know was that this man, this seemingly random, unimportant stranger, was someone who would change his life in ways he could never have predicted. Keanu Reeves, the man Jake had just insulted without even knowing who he was more than just an actor. And soon, Jake would discover just how wrong he was to judge him. For now, however, Jake had bigger things to focus on, like the business, opportunities waiting for him. But little did he know, this seemingly insignificant moment would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, respect, and what it truly means to make it in the world. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? Jake didn't think much about his brief encounter with the mysterious man until the next day. His phone buzzed incessantly as he sat in his sleek downtown office, sipping a coffee that was probably more expensive than most people's weekly grocery bill. He had a full agenda, a dozen meetings scheduled, and several deals that needed his immediate attention. But no matter how many times he glanced at the screen, something about that conversation from yesterday kept creeping into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man at the event had said something important. A quick Google search told Jake everything he needed to know. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves, the actor, philanthropist, and all-around enigma. Jake stared at the screen in disbelief. The man he'd insulted yesterday was, in fact, a global icon. He wasn't just some guy in a casual jacket. Jake grimaced, replaying the conversation in his mind. He had no idea who he was talking to. Worse, he had made that comment in front of dozens of people. Business leaders, potential clients, and a few colleagues. His face flushed with embarrassment. "How could I have been so stupid?" he muttered to himself, rubbing his temples. The sting of regret lingered, but Jake wasn't the type to dwell on mistakes. He prided himself on his ability to move past setbacks. This was just another bump in the road, he thought. I can fix this. But then the calls started coming in. First, it was his assistant, Claire, interrupting him during a meeting. "Jake, there's someone on the phone for you. He says it's urgent." Jake, distracted and still brooding over his embarrassing encounter, grabbed the phone. "This is Jake." "Hello, Mr. Mitchell, I hope you're doing well," came a smooth, confident voice. Jake instantly recognized it as Keanu Reeves. His stomach dropped. I didn't expect you to call," Jake stammered, unsure of how to proceed. Keanu's tone remained calm. "No worries. I wanted to let you know that I've been thinking about our conversation. I'm not upset, but you might want to reconsider how you judge others, especially when you don't know who they are." Jake's heart was racing. He wanted to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way. It was a stupid thing to say." Keanu chuckled softly. "I'm sure it was, but it's not about the words. It's about the mindset behind them. It's easy to think we're better than others, to dismiss people based on appearances. But the truth is, everyone has something valuable to offer, even if they don't fit the mold you expect." Jake sat back in his chair, stunned. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. What is this guy talking about? He was just trying to be polite, to make a connection, but Keanu wasn't done. "You'll find, Mr. Mitchell, that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can change the course of your life, but it's up to you whether or not you recognize that." Before Jake could respond, Keanu ended the call with a simple, "Good luck." Jake stood there holding the phone in his hand, his thoughts swirling. He wanted to dismiss the conversation as another eccentric actor's ramblings, but deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. What if Keanu was right? That night, Jake couldn't stop thinking about it. The more he tried to focus on work, the more his mind wandered back to the conversation. He was a man who was used to being in control, making decisions with ease and knowing exactly where he stood. But now he felt like he was on shaky ground. Maybe there's more to this than I thought. His next meeting did nothing to help his growing unease. As he pitched a new idea to a group of potential investors, one of them, an influential tech mogul, raised an eyebrow. "Jake, your presentation is fine, but there's something missing. You're selling the product, but you're not selling the vision. You're coming across as too robotic." Jake froze. He had been called a lot of things in his life, but robotic was a new one. His eyes darted to the other investors around the table. They didn't seem as engaged as he had hoped. His mind raced, and for the first time in years he felt out of his depth. After the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing his edge. The people he was working with were starting to see through his polished exterior. Maybe Keanu had a point about appearances after all. As Jake returned to his office, Claire came in with a message. "You've got an invitation to a dinner event tomorrow night. It's from Keanu Reeves's foundation." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Keanu to follow up so soon. Part of him wanted to decline. He had a million things on his plate and wasn't sure he was ready to face Keanu again. But another part of him, something deep inside, felt like this was a chance to make things right. Taking a deep breath, Jake made his decision. "I'll go," he said, not even fully understanding why. That evening, as he got ready for the dinner, Jake caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He straightened his tie, checked his cufflinks, and for the first time in a long while, he wondered if he was more than just the businessman in the sharp suit. Was there something else he was missing? Something that Keanu had already discovered? The next evening, Jake walked into the upscale restaurant where the dinner was being held. The moment he stepped inside, the quiet elegance of the place almost knocked the breath out of him. Low lighting, the hum of soft conversations, and the aroma of expensive wine and gourmet food filled the air. People in designer suits and elegant dresses mingled, their laughter and chatter blending into a symphony of high society. Jake had been to hundreds of events like this, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the idea that Keanu Reeves would be there, or perhaps it was the feeling that he was stepping into a world he didn't truly understand. He had always felt confident in these environments, but now he felt like an outsider. He was ushered to his seat at a long, polished table. To his surprise, Keanu wasn't sitting far away. The actor was talking to a group of people, his relaxed demeanor completely at odds with the hustle and bustle of the room. Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach. The memory of their last encounter lingered, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face Keanu again. But then Keanu caught his eye. With a small, almost imperceptible smile, he gave Jake a slight nod. It was as if he had been expecting him all along. Jake walked over, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Keanu," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Thanks for the invite. I didn't think you'd actually follow through." Keanu smiled warmly, his eyes twinkling. "I'm glad you came. I've been meaning to talk to you." Jake blinked in surprise. Talk to me? He had expected some form of punishment, or at the very least an uncomfortable confrontation, but not a genuine conversation. Keanu gestured for Jake to take a seat. "Let's not make this awkward. I'd rather have a real conversation than pretend nothing happened." Jake sat, feeling the weight of his earlier actions settle in his stomach. The dinner began, but Jake couldn't fully focus on the plates of exquisite food being passed around. His mind was racing. He had underestimated Keanu, both as a person and as someone who understood the value of self-awareness. "Look, I want to apologize for what I said," Jake started, his voice low. "I was out of line. I was judgmental and rude, and I've been thinking about it ever since." Keanu looked at him thoughtfully, not in the way that someone might offer forgiveness quickly, but with an understanding that made Jake feel like he was being seen, really seen. "Apologies are only meaningful if they come with change," Keanu replied gently. "What I want to know is, why did you feel the need to say those things in the first place?" Jake stared at his wine glass for a moment, swirling the deep red liquid. "I don't know," he confessed. "I've always prided myself on being direct. In the business world, people respect that. People respect confidence. But I guess I've built my whole identity on being right all the time. I didn't take a second to consider that maybe I could be wrong, or that my perspective isn't the only one." Keanu leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping gently against his glass. "It's easy to get caught in that trap. We all do it at some point. We forget that being right isn't the most important thing. It's about connection, about understanding others." Jake swallowed, his discomfort growing. He hadn't expected this conversation to take this turn. He had assumed Keanu would brush him off, maybe even take the high road and leave it at that. But now here he was, being challenged in a way he hadn't been in years. "Yeah, I think you're right," Jake muttered, more to himself than to Keanu. "I've been so focused on proving myself, on being the smartest in the room, that I never stopped to think about how I'm affecting the people around me. He broke off, feeling a mix of frustration and guilt. "I'm not sure how to fix this. How do I start over?" Keanu smiled again, a small knowing smile. "Start by being present. Listen more than you speak. Be open to learning from others, even when it feels uncomfortable. It's a process, Jake. It doesn't happen overnight. But the first step is being willing to grow." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. Grow? The idea seemed simple, yet it terrified him. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, walls that kept people at a distance, walls that allowed him to stay in control, to keep his place at the top. The thought of tearing those walls down felt impossible. As the evening wore on, Jake found himself engaged in conversations he would have previously dismissed as meaningless. He listened to people share their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself genuinely intrigued. He began to realize that there was so much more to life and to success than just business deals and profits. There was human connection, empathy, and a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be successful. Later, as the dinner came to a close, Keanu approached Jake again. "I think you're starting to get it," he said softly, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're on the right path. Just keep going." Jake nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while he felt like he was on the verge of something bigger than himself. Maybe Keanu was right. Maybe he had been looking at everything all wrong. As Jake left the restaurant, the city lights twinkling around him, he couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something new. Something far more meaningful than just the business empire he had spent years building. This was about becoming a better version of himself, a version who could appreciate the people around him, who could connect with others, not just to get ahead, but because it was the right thing to do. Jake woke up the next morning with a strange sense of clarity. It was as if the fog that had clouded his mind for years had finally lifted. He had always been driven, always focused on making more money, scaling his business, and being the best in every room he entered. But now, after his conversation with Keanu the night before, everything seemed different. The questions that had been buried deep in his mind were now surfacing, demanding answers. As he sat at his desk, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his high-rise office, he reflected on everything Keanu had said. Start by being present. Listen more than you speak. Be open to learning from others, even when it feels uncomfortable. Jake had always thought of himself as a leader, but Keanu had shown him that leadership wasn't just about dictating orders or asserting control. It was about understanding people, connecting with them on a deeper level, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to learn and grow. The thought both excited and terrified him. Jake's assistant, Claire, knocked on the door and poked her head in. "Morning, Jake. You've got a few meetings lined up today, but I just wanted to remind you, there's a charity event tonight. It's for Keanu's foundation. I thought you might want to go, considering." Jake was still processing the weight of the previous night's conversation, so Claire's mention of the event caught him off guard. He hadn't thought about it since he left the dinner, but now the idea of spending more time with Keanu seemed both daunting and intriguing. He looked at Claire, his mind racing. "Yeah, I'll go." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Really? I mean, I know the dinner went well, but you're usually pretty selective about these things." Jake nodded slowly. "I know, I need to be there. I think it's time I make a change." Claire's expression softened, her curiosity piqued. "I'll make sure you're ready for it then." The charity event was a completely different atmosphere from the business gala the night before. The room was filled with an eclectic mix of people, celebrities, philanthropists, and everyday heroes who had made a difference in their communities. The energy was warm, and Jake immediately noticed that people weren't just mingling for connections. They were engaging with each other as human beings. Keanu was there, of course, but this time he was in his element. He was talking to a group of people, listening intently and laughing. He looked relaxed, at peace with himself in a way that Jake found almost enviable. As Jake entered the room, Keanu caught sight of him and walked over with a friendly smile. "Glad you could make it," he said, his voice warm, as though nothing had ever been awkward between them. Jake was still a little unsure of himself, but he felt more grounded than before. "I'm glad I came too." Keanu didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Let's get a drink," he suggested, leading Jake to the bar where the conversation naturally flowed. As they chatted, Jake found himself listening more than speaking. He wasn't used to being the quiet one in a conversation, but this time, he was more interested in hearing what others had to say. Keanu's calm demeanor was contagious. Jake realized how much he had been missing out on by only focusing on his own voice. He learned about Keanu's childhood, his passion for philanthropy, and how he had used his fame to uplift others. It wasn't about the money or the fame. It was about using your platform to make the world a better place. It was a philosophy Jake hadn't given much thought to before. Later in the evening, Keanu introduced Jake to a few of the other guests. He was surprised to find that the people Keanu surrounded himself with weren't the typical power players Jake was used to. These were ordinary people, teachers, doctors, community leaders, who had devoted their lives to giving back. One conversation in particular stuck with Jake. He was talking to a woman named Sarah, who had started a non-profit organization to provide clean water to communities in Africa. "I've been working on this for 10 years, she said, her voice passionate but humble. "It's been hard, but every time we install a new well, I'm reminded of why I do it. People don't need to be famous to change the world. They just need to care." Jake's heart swelled with admiration. This is what it's really about, he thought. This is what I've been missing. For the rest of the evening, Jake found himself reflecting on his own life and his purpose. His success in business had always been about building something for himself, creating an empire that would make him untouchable. But now he wondered if that was enough. Was being the best in business really the end goal? Or was there something more? As the night wound down, Keanu pulled Jake aside. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" he asked, his voice sincere. Jake nodded. "I think I am. I've spent so much time thinking I had all the answers, but I've been so focused on winning that I never really stopped to think about why I'm doing any of it." Keanu smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "It's a big step, Jake, but it's just the beginning. Keep questioning yourself. Keep challenging your ideas and the answers will come." Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the pressure to have everything figured out. He was on a journey, and he was finally willing to take the first step into the unknown. As he left the event that night, Jake couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had come to the city to network, to build his empire, but instead, he had found something much more valuable, a new perspective on life and on what it truly meant to be successful. The next few weeks were a blur for Jake. He threw himself into his work, but this time something was different. He no longer measured success purely by profits or high-stakes business deals. Instead, he began to reevaluate his approach to leadership, focusing more on his team, the community, and the impact his company could have on the world. It wasn't easy. The habits he had built over the years were deeply ingrained, and old ways of thinking were hard to shake off. He found himself questioning everything, and at times that felt overwhelming. What if he was making a mistake? What if all this introspection would ruin everything he had worked so hard for? The pressure mounted. Investors, who had always been impressed by Jake's sharp instincts, began to notice the shift. Meetings were starting to take longer, and Jake was asking more questions than usual. He was pushing back against ideas that didn't align with his new values, even if they promised substantial profits. His team was noticing the change too. One afternoon, as Jake was reviewing a project proposal with his lead investor, Martin, the tension in the room was palpable. Martin had always been a staunch supporter of Jake's ruthless business style, but today he seemed increasingly frustrated with Jake's new approach. "Jake," Martin said, his voice tight, "I'm not sure where you're going with this. This company needs to keep its focus on what makes money. All this talk about impact is great, but we can't afford to get sentimental about it. You're turning down solid business opportunities because of this new direction, and it's starting to worry me." Jake's heart raced. The familiar tug-of-war between his old self and his new self was pulling him in two different directions. On one hand, the businessman in him knew that Martin had a point. Investors didn't care about morals or philosophies. They cared about returns. On the other hand, Jake had been thinking a lot about Keanu's words. Could he really abandon everything he'd learned about people, connection, and impact just to chase after the same old empty victories? "Martin, I hear you," Jake said slowly, his voice steady despite the inner turmoil. "But we're more than just a company chasing profits. We're in a position to make a real difference, and that's something I can't ignore. I want us to be known for more than just our bottom line. I want us to be a company that stands for something." Martin's eyes narrowed. "You're letting your personal life get in the way of business. You're changing the rules of the game, and it's not going to work. People will lose faith in you, Jake." Jake's stomach tightened. He had been waiting for this moment. knowing that at some point he'd have to make a choice, stay the course with the tried-and-true methods of success, or take a risk and venture into unknown territory. He exhaled, his decision clear in his mind. "I'm not changing the rules, Martin, I'm just redefining them." For a moment there was silence in the room. Martin's face was unreadable, and Jake could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. But there was no turning back now. Jake had made his choice. "I understand if you don't agree," Jake continued, "but this is the direction I'm taking. If you can't support that, then maybe it's time to part ways." The words hung in the air heavy with finality. Martin stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "I don't think this is the way to go, Jake, but you're the boss. You do what you think is best." The meeting ended with a stiff handshake. But Jake's mind was already elsewhere. He felt a surge of uncertainty, but also something he hadn't felt in years, a deep sense of relief. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. He wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He was excited. That night, Jake met with Keanu again. The dinner had been arranged by Keanu's foundation as part of a new initiative to bring together like-minded individuals who wanted to make a positive impact on the world. Jake had been invited not just as a guest, but as a potential partner. Keanu greeted him warmly, his presence as calming as ever. "Jake, I'm glad you could make it. How are things going?" Jake smiled, though the tension of the day still lingered in his mind. "It's been a crazy couple of weeks. I've had to make some tough decisions, but I think I'm finally on the right path." Keanu nodded knowingly. "It's never easy. The hardest decisions are often the most important ones. I can see you're in the midst of something big." Jake took a deep breath. "I've had to redefine what success means for me. I thought it was all about winning, making money, being on top. But now I see that real success is about how you use what you have to help others." Keanu's smile grew wider. "You're starting to understand. Success is about legacy, not just wealth. It's about leaving the world better than you found it." Jake's heart swelled with gratitude. He had spent years chasing the wrong things, but now he understood that true success didn't come from amassing wealth. It came from helping others, from creating opportunities, and from being a force for good in the world. As the night wore on, Jake found himself surrounded by people who were just as passionate about making a difference as he was. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in his life he felt like he was on the right path. His business was still important to him, but now he had a new sense of purpose. He wanted his company to stand for something beyond the bottom line. Keanu gave him one last piece of advice as the evening came to a close. "You've got this, Jake. Just remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about being real. People connect with that more than anything else." Jake left the event feeling more certain of his journey than ever. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid of it. The old Jake, the arrogant businessman focused only on success, was gone. In his place was someone new, someone who understood that true leadership was about empathy, connection, and making a lasting impact. The next chapter of his life was just beginning, and for the first time Jake was ready to embrace it. Jake's world seemed to be shifting with every passing day. As the weeks turned into months, he continued to make strides in changing the way he ran his business, but the road was far from smooth. Each decision was like walking a tightrope, balancing his new values with the demands of a ruthless industry that didn't care about anything other than results. Despite the internal transformations Jake was going through, the external pressures were unrelenting. Investors, clients, and even his closest colleagues started to question his new direction. Some were supportive, even inspired by his focus on social responsibility and human connection, but others were skeptical. They saw his shift as a weakness, a departure from the tried-and-true formula that had made him successful in the first place. One morning, Jake received an unexpected call from Martin, his lead investor, who had been notably absent since their last meeting. "Jake, we need to talk," Martin said, his tone clipped. Jake's stomach sank. He had expected this call, but hearing it now, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change for good. "What's going on?" Jake asked, trying to sound confident, though a gnawing unease had begun to settle in. Martin wasted no time getting to the point. "We've been looking at the numbers. The recent shift in your focus, this whole idea of impact first, profit second, it's not working. The investors are getting nervous. We've seen a decline in returns, and frankly, there's concern that you're losing sight of what made this company successful in the first place. Jake felt a knot tighten in his chest. Martin, I understand your concerns, but the thing is, I've been thinking a lot about what success really means. I've realized that making money isn't the only thing that matters. If we can't build something that helps people and makes a real impact, then what's the point? There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Martin replied. Jake, we've had this conversation before. You're a smart guy and I respect you, but the reality is this. The business world isn't about feelings, it's about numbers. If you keep pushing this agenda, you'll end up losing everything you've worked for. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he felt the pull of his old life, the life that had made him wealthy, powerful, and respected in the industry. The temptation to return to what he knew was strong, but as he looked back on everything he had, learned he knew there was no going back. I'm not willing to sacrifice what I believe in, Jake said firmly, the resolve in his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. If we have to part ways, then we part ways, but I'm not going to compromise on my values. Another silence followed, but this time it was a silence filled with understanding. I thought you might say that, Martin replied, his voice softer now. I just wanted to make sure you were fully aware of the consequences. You're a bold guy, Jake, but sometimes boldness can be your downfall. I'm willing to take that risk, Jake said, his heart pounding in his chest. Martin sighed. All right, but know this. I can't back you if you go down this road. You'll have to find a new group of investors who are willing to take that risk with you. Jake hung up the phone with a mixture of dread and relief. There was no turning back now. He had made his decision, but he didn't know where it would take him. All he could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. Later that evening, Jake attended another of Keanu's foundation events. The quiet hum of the crowd, the soft clinking of glasses, and the peaceful atmosphere all seemed to offer him some comfort as he made his way through the crowd. The discussions at these events were always centered on something greater than themselves, building communities, supporting causes, and using whatever resources they had to help those who needed it most. Keanu noticed Jake walking in and immediately approached him with a warm smile. Jake, how's it going? Jake managed a tight smile, but his mind was still reeling from the conversation with Martin. It's been a rough day. I just had a big conversation with one of my investors, and let's just say, I don't think they're happy with the direction I'm going. Keanu's smile softened, and he nodded in understanding. That's always the hard part, but it's part of the process. Changing the way people think takes time, and it's never easy. You have to ask yourself, though, if the people around you truly share your vision. If they don't, then maybe it's time to let them go. Jake looked at Keanu, his words striking a chord deep within him. He had never been good at letting go, whether it was of relationships, ideas, or people who didn't align with his vision. But Keanu was right. He couldn't afford to stay stuck in a world that no longer fit who he was becoming. I think you're right, Jake admitted, the weight of his decisions slowly lifting. I can't keep trying to please people who don't believe in what I'm doing. Keanu clapped him on the back. Exactly. You're doing this for a bigger purpose, and those who get it will stick around. The rest, well, they'll move on, and you'll be better off without them. Jake felt a sense of calm settle over him. He didn't know what would happen in the coming weeks or months, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that he was on the right path. There would be challenges ahead, of course, but he was ready. He had already started down the road of true change, and no amount of doubt or fear would stop him now. As the night wore on, Jake found himself surrounded by people who had found meaning in their work, not because it made them wealthy, but because it made a difference. He was beginning to see that the world was full of people who didn't measure success by how much they earned, but by how much they gave. And in that moment, Jake realized something profound. The journey he had begun wasn't just about changing the way he ran his business. It was about changing the way he saw the world, and that change, real, lasting change, was worth any price. Jake's decision to let go of his old investors was one of the hardest things he had ever done. The consequences were immediate. The board members, who had once supported him, now began pulling back. Some of them simply disappeared, while others expressed their concern in hushed conversations. The deal that Jake had been working on for months fell apart when the new investors couldn't be found in time. The projects he had so carefully nurtured began to lose momentum. But despite all of this, Jake felt lighter. He wasn't carrying the burden of pretending anymore. For the first time in his life, he was pursuing a purpose that wasn't driven by greed or the pressure to succeed at any cost. He wasn't completely sure how he would navigate the coming storm, but he knew he had made the right choice. Keanu, ever the calming influence, reached out a few days later. His message was simple. "We need to talk, let's meet up for lunch." Jake agreed, not knowing what to expect, but feeling that the conversation would bring him the clarity he needed. They met at a small cafe in the heart of the city, far from the sleek boardrooms and high-rise buildings where Jake usually spent his time. The ambience was cozy and relaxed, with sunlight filtering through large windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden tables. The place was busy, but there was an undeniable calm to it, a peacefulness that Jake hadn't experienced in a while. Keanu was already seated when Jake arrived, looking as unbothered as ever. He greeted Jake with a smile and motioned to the chair across from him. "Thanks for meeting me," Keanu said. "How are you holding up?" Jake took a deep breath and sat down, feeling a weight in his chest. "Honestly, it's been rough. I've lost a lot of support, and my business is starting to feel like it's slipping through my fingers. I don't know if I made the right choice. Maybe I should have stuck to what I knew. Maybe I was too quick to change everything." Keanu listened intently, his gaze steady but kind. "It's natural to feel that way. You've spent years building something, and now it's crumbling. But remember, Jake, change is uncomfortable. The easy road is the one you've been on, the one that made you successful in the eyes of many. But the hard road? That's the one where real growth happens. That's the road where your purpose, your true legacy, begins to take shape." Jake ran his hand through his hair. "But what if it all falls apart? What if I lose everything I've worked for, all the sacrifices I've made, everything I've built?" Keanu's expression softened. "You know, I've lost everything more than once in my life. My career, my reputation, my sense of purpose. It was only when I hit rock bottom that I realized it wasn't the external things that made me who I am. It was the internal change, the understanding of what truly matters, that gave me peace." Jake's eyes widened. He hadn't known that. Keanu had gone through such hardship. The actor, the philanthropist, the spiritual guide, he seemed so invincible. But now, sitting across from him, Jake saw something different. Keanu had weathered storms far darker than anything Jake had faced. "How did you get through it?" Jake asked, his voice quieter now. Keanu smiled softly, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding. "I focused on what I could control. I let go of the need for approval, the need for external validation, and I surrounded myself with people who saw the world the way I wanted to see it, people who were focused on making a difference, not just making money." Jake sat in silence for a moment, processing the weight of Keanu's words. He had always been afraid of losing his status, of being seen as a failure, but in that moment, he realized that success couldn't be measured by external markers like wealth or power. It had to be measured by the impact he made on others, the way he lived his life. Keanu broke the silence. "Jake, you're on the right path. It's not going to be easy and it's not going to happen overnight. But the people who truly matter will see your vision. The rest, they'll fall away." Jake nodded, his thoughts swirling in a whirlwind. He wasn't ready to give up his dream just yet. He had worked too hard for this, and he now understood that this was his true calling. He was here to do more than make a profit. He was here to make a difference. "I'm scared, Keanu," Jake confessed, "but I'm willing to keep going, even if it means losing everything." Keanu's smile deepened. "That's what real courage looks like. You're doing this for the right reasons, Jake. That's the difference between just being successful and living a life that matters." The days following their lunch were a blur of action, but Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He spent less time focusing on the numbers and more on the people, the team members who believed in him, the clients who were willing to take risks with him, and the communities who could benefit from the changes he wanted to make. Jake realized that yes, his company was going through a tough transition, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. A few weeks later, he received a call that would change everything. One of his old partners, someone who had walked away when Jake started to shift his focus, called him out of the blue. "Jake," the voice on the other end said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you've been doing. I didn't get it at first. I thought you were making a huge mistake. But now I see it. I see what you're trying to build, and I want in. I want to help you make this work." Jake could hardly believe what he was hearing. The tides were turning. People were starting to see the value in his vision. That night, he met with his team to share the news. The room was filled with excitement as they realized that what they were building wasn't just a business. It was a movement. Jake sat back looking at the faces of the people who believed in him, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. This was only the beginning. The future was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. Jake's newfound determination began to shape the future of his company, but the road to rebuilding was anything but easy. The decision to stay true to his values, his commitment to making a real difference, meant that he had to sacrifice many of the comforts and luxuries that had come with his former way of doing business. Investors had pulled out. Deals he had once considered easy wins had fallen apart, but with every loss, there was a newfound sense of purpose guiding him forward. The real test, Jake realized, wasn't just about building a company that was profitable. It was about building a company that could stand for something bigger than just profits. He started to meet with social enterprises, non-profit organizations, and other businesses that shared his vision of positive change. Slowly but surely, his network expanded, and his vision began to resonate with those who had been in the same position as he was, wondering how to navigate a business world that often felt heartless. One afternoon, as Jake sat at his desk sorting through proposals from potential partners, an email arrived that caught his attention. It was from one of his old colleagues, Sarah, someone he had worked with before he'd made his bold move towards social responsibility. The subject line read, "Let's talk. I've been watching you." Jake clicked open the email, feeling a twinge of curiosity. Sarah had been one of the more skeptical members of his team when he first made the decision to change direction. She had always been driven by numbers and outcomes, not by the idea of social impact. But the tone of her email seemed different. Jake quickly typed a response, setting up a meeting for the following day. The next morning, Sarah walked into Jake's office, her expression unreadable. She was wearing a smart business suit, the same kind she had always worn when they worked together, and her professional demeanor hadn't changed a bit. But there was something about her that was different. Her eyes were softer, less guarded. She seemed more open, more human. "Jake," Sarah began, sitting down across from him, "I've been watching you, watching what you've been doing. At first I didn't get it. I thought you were making a huge mistake. You've lost so much, your reputation, investors, your clients. It seemed like you were throwing everything away." Jake nodded, not surprised by her words. He had heard them from others, but hearing them from someone he had worked so closely with stung a little more. "I understand why you'd think that. It wasn't an easy decision, but I realized that I couldn't keep going down the same path. Not if I wanted to feel like I was actually doing something meaningful with my life." Sarah leaned back, her eyes still locked on him. "I get it now. I see what you're trying to do, and honestly, I think I was wrong. I've been stuck in this cycle of focusing on the short-term gains, the easy wins. But there's something bigger at play here, something more important than just making money. You've inspired me, Jake. I want to help you rebuild. I want to be part of this." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this, not from Sarah. The old Sarah would have never spoken like this. Jake paused, unsure of what to say. "You're willing to take a chance on this with me? Even after everything that's happened?" Sarah smiled, the kind of smile Jake hadn't seen in years, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Yeah, I believe in what you're doing. And I want to be part of it. Let's rebuild, but this time let's do it right. The feeling in Jake's chest was unlike anything he'd felt in a long time. It was hope, real hope. He hadn't just convinced investors or clients about his vision, he had convinced someone who had been right there with him, someone who had seen the value of chasing more than just profits. She had seen the possibility of making a real difference, just like he had. "We'll need to build a new strategy," Jake said, feeling the weight of the decision in his words. "This is going to take time, but I'm ready. Are you?" Sarah nodded, determination in her eyes. "I'm all in." Over the next few months, Jake and Sarah worked tirelessly to rebuild the company. They created new partnerships with organizations that focused on sustainable business practices, environmental initiatives, and community support. Slowly but surely, the new business model began to take shape. It wasn't easy. They faced criticism from old colleagues and investors who couldn't see the long-term vision. But with each step forward, Jake found his resolve strengthening. The team began to grow. They hired people who were as passionate about making a difference as they were about building a successful company. The culture shifted from one of intense competition and secrecy to one of collaboration, transparency, and shared values. The change was palpable in the office. People smiled more. They worked harder, not because they had to, but because they believed in the mission. But there were still moments when Jake doubted himself. He'd walk into a boardroom full of people who questioned his vision, who insisted that profits had to come first. He'd feel the weight of their skepticism, the pressure to return to the old ways of doing business. But every time, he remembered what Keanu had said to him about the importance of staying true to his beliefs no matter how difficult the road. One day, after a particularly grueling meeting with a potential investor who wasn't convinced by the new direction, Jake sat alone in his office, staring at the window. It was raining outside, the kind of rain that made the city look like it was drowning in its own reflection. But as Jake looked out at the storm, something inside him shifted. The world was unpredictable. Success wasn't guaranteed. But what mattered now was that he was building something meaningful, something that would outlast any fleeting business trend. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a leader with a purpose. That night, Jake met with Keanu for dinner again. The conversation had become something of a ritual for him, an anchor in the storm. As they sat down to eat, Jake shared the progress they had made and the hurdles they were still facing. Keanu listened intently, his usual calm demeanor a steadying force. "You're doing great, Jake. It's a tough journey, but you're on the right track. Just remember, it's not about the destination. It's about the impact you have on the people around you. Keep that focus and the rest will follow." Jake smiled, feeling the weight of Keanu's words settle deep within him. "Thanks, Keanu, for everything." Keanu raised his glass. "Here's to new beginnings, Jake, and to making a difference." Jake raised his glass too, a sense of peace settling over him. This was just the beginning. The road would still be long, but he was ready for it. Months passed, and the transformation of Jake's company was nothing short of extraordinary. What had once been a business focused solely on profit now stood as a beacon of positive change, a testament to the power of staying true to one's values. Jake had learned the hard way that success wasn't just measured in dollar signs, it was measured in the impact you had on the world around you. The new business model was flourishing. Clients who had once been skeptical were beginning to come around. They saw the long-term potential in Jake's vision. New investors who aligned with his goals started to knock on his door, eager to be a part of something meaningful. But it wasn't the financial gains that kept Jake going. It was the stories. The small victories, the success stories from the communities his company had been able to support, the lives that had been changed. One day, Jake found himself sitting at his desk, looking out the window. He could see the city's skyline in the distance, but his thoughts were far away. The company had grown, but with that growth came more responsibility. And while Jake felt proud of what they had accomplished, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much more to be done. Keanu had been a constant source of wisdom, and now more than ever, Jake needed to remember the lessons he'd learned through their conversations. He knew that he couldn't change the world overnight, but he could make a difference one step at a time. It was then that his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, who had become his closest ally through this whole process. "Jake, we've been invited to speak at a global business conference next month. They want us to share our story, how we've made the shift and what we've learned along the way. I think this could be a big opportunity for us." Jake smiled as he read the message. He hadn't expected this. A global business conference. It seemed like such a far cry from where he had been not long ago, the arrogant businessman who cared only about profits. He quickly responded, "Let's do it. Let's show them what's possible when you lead with purpose." The weeks leading up to the conference were a whirlwind of preparation. Jake, Sarah, and the team worked tirelessly to refine their message. They wanted to make sure that they were not only telling their story, but also inspiring others to take action. They wanted to prove that it was possible to build a business that cared as much about people as it did about profits. When the day of the conference arrived, Jake found himself standing in front of a crowd of hundreds of business leaders, entrepreneurs, and changemakers. It was surreal. The once arrogant businessman had transformed into a thought leader, someone whose story had the power to inspire change. As Jake took the stage, the lights dimmed and the audience fell silent. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he remembered what Keanu had said to him so many times. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real. People connect with authenticity. Jake took a deep breath and began. "When I first started this journey, I was like many of you. I was focused on the bottom line, on growing my company, on making money. But over time, I realized that there's more to business than just profits. There's more to success than just numbers. What truly matters is how we impact the world around us." The room was quiet as Jake shared the story of how he had faced setbacks, doubts, and the temptation to return to his old ways. But he also shared how he had found a new path, one that wasn't about instant gratification, but about creating lasting change. He talked about the sacrifices, the difficult decisions, and the way his company had grown to become a force for good. "As business leaders," Jake continued, "we have a responsibility to create value that goes beyond the financials. We have the power to change lives, to make our communities better, to protect our environment. And the best part? Doing the right thing isn't just the right thing to do. It's also good for business." As Jake spoke, he saw the audience react. Some were nodding along, others were scribbling down notes. But there was something more, something intangible in the air. Jake could feel it. The energy in the room had shifted. People weren't just listening to a story, they were feeling inspired. They were ready to make a change. Later that evening, as the conference came to a close, Jake was approached by several people who were eager to discuss the ideas he had shared. They were interested in how they could incorporate purpose-driven strategies into their own businesses. Jake spent hours talking to like-minded individuals, answering questions and offering advice. But it wasn't the business deals or the networking that meant the most to him. It was the realization that his message had resonated. As he walked out of the conference hall that night, Jake felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had no idea where this journey would ultimately lead, but he knew that he was on the right path. His company wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And more importantly, it was making a difference. That night, as Jake sat in his hotel room, he received a text from Keanu. It simply read, "I'm proud of you." Jake smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He had come so far from the arrogant businessman who had once insulted Keanu, and now he was part of something much bigger than himself. The next morning, Jake woke up early and took a walk around the city. He had learned so much along the way about business, about people, and about himself. The journey had been filled with highs and lows, but through it all he had found a purpose that was worth fighting for. He had realized that success wasn't about being the richest or most powerful person in the room. It was about the legacy you left behind. And Jake was determined to leave a legacy that would inspire others to lead with purpose, integrity, and compassion. As the sun rose over the city, Jake felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. His journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning, What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough?